breaking and entering, drunk and disorderly, law and order. A former prosecutor and a defence lawyer, not your typical pairing. And the result? Conversations about crime and punishment that are guaranteed to get you thinking.
Welcome to Justice Matters with Joe Crowley and Lizzie Green, a brand new weekly podcast. Our episodes are available on Apple Podcast, Spotify and YouTube. Check out our Instagram for clips at Justice Matters Pod. Enjoy the episode. This episode contains descriptions of violence, intoxication and murder. Listener discretion is advised.
Good morning, Joe.
Hello, Lizzie. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I am well.
Yes, I've always been told to say I'm well rather than I'm good, but
right.
I think I'm good as
you
well.
are good.
Yeah.
You are a moral person as well as being well, I'm sure.
And I've got a good topic for us today.
Excellent.
So it's colloquially known as the one punch can kill laws.
Yes.
Officially, the charge for a one punch which kills someone is called unlawful striking,
Yes.
causing death.
Yes.
And I wanted to talk about this today because just in the last month, it's been in the news that a prisoner called Kieran Loveridge, who was convicted in 2012
Yep.
of manslaughter in relation to the death of an 18-year-old man called Thomas Kelly, he's just been released on parole. It's a bit of a high-profile case. It was the case that triggered the one-punch laws in New South Wales.
Yeah, because they're sort of new laws in inverted commas, and they've only been in how long? 10 years?
About 10 years
Yeah.
across the states.
Yeah.
And so I thought we'd have a little look at this case. There are a couple of things that I feel a bit unsettled about with the one-punch laws.
Yes.
And I think that these kinds of landmark cases that triggered legislative change are important to understand and have a chat about.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm going to give you the story of Thomas Kelly.
Yes.
I'm going to say it's his story. He was the victim.
Yes.
But obviously there'll be a lot of references to the accused,
Yep.
Loveridge. Both Thomas Kelly and Loveridge were 18 at the time that this offence was committed. And Loveridge had been out with friends. It was the 7th of July, 2012. They were in Sydney. They'd started their night at about 5 p.m. with a carton of 24 vodka cans.
Wow. Okay.
By the time the group of 5 guys got into the city at 7:30 p.m., most of those cans had been drunk. So you can imagine the levels of intoxication were substantial.
Yeah.
They headed for the casino. As they walked along, it was clear that Loveridge was drunk, and he would go up to people that they passed, just randomly yelling in their faces.
Right.
He was denied entry at the casino cargo bar, but he was then admitted to the Pontoon Bar in Darling Harbour, where he continued to drink. At around 9 p.m, he caught a cab with 2 friends to King's Cross. They visited a couple of bars, but again were refused entry at one. It said because they weren't on the guest list. I don't know if
Okay.
it
Yeah.
was also because he was intoxicated. And by this stage, it was said that Loveridge was in an agitated and unpredictable state. It was about 9:45 at this stage. So at about 10 p.m, a witness said that Loveridge and his mates were being loud, pushing and, play fighting each other. And a guy called Marco Campononi
Okay.
and his 2 friends were walking past. And Loveridge, with no warning and no reason, elbowed Marco above his left eyebrow, lacerating his skin and drawing blood. They didn't know each other. Marco went to hospital. He had the injury treated, didn't need stitches, but he ended up being the subject of a charge against Loveridge as a result of the rest of the night.
So it was a sucker punch.
It was with his elbow. Yeah.
Okay.
About 40 seconds after he delivered that blow to Marco, and on the same street, Loveridge was standing against the wall of the Mercure Hotel. Thomas Kelly and 2 of his female friends were walking along the street. Kelly was on his phone at the time, and they were headed to meet other friends at the Trademark Hotel. For no reason, Loveridge took 3 steps towards Kelly and the girls. With no notice, he punched Kelly to the ground while he was still on his phone. The punch carried such force that Kelly was knocked to the ground where his head hit the footpath. He immediately went limp and stopped moving.
Mm.
A pool of blood started to form around his head. Medical evidence later revealed that he had suffered a severe fracture to his head and severe injuries to his brain, which unfortunately proved to be fatal.
Mm.
Kelly and Loveridge were complete strangers to each other.
Yeah.
They'd never exchanged a word. Kelly's two friends both described the punch to the police afterwards, and one said it was a forceful punch that looked like it required a lot of effort to deliver. Both girls said that the punch caused him to fall backwards where he hit his head. They said that they saw Loveridge look at Kelly on the ground before he sprinted away up the street. They said he looked angry and possibly intoxicated.
Mm.
The paramedics arrived 6 or 7 minutes later, and evidence of the ambulance officer on the scene said that at that point Kelly was still breathing, but he didn't respond to verbal or painful stimuli. He had a strong pulse, but his pupils were fixed and his airway was blocked with blood and saliva. He was determined to be in a severe and life-threatening condition. He arrived at hospital at about 10:30, was intubated and ventilated, but he was deeply unconscious with no movement. An urgent operation was performed, but the pressure on his brain increased following the operation. And after remaining in intensive care for 2 days and considering the catastrophic nature of his injuries, he was removed from life support on the 9th of July. Obviously, that was just horrific and triggered an investigation. And what that investigation revealed was that that wasn't the end of Loveridge's night.
Wow.
So he's already assaulted Marco, then he's punched Kelly, but he continued to roam around King's Cross after that attack on Kelly. At about 10:15, at the same time Kelly was being treated by paramedics, two other guys, David Nofaluma and Brendan Newton, arrived in King's Cross. Now, David knew Loveridge through a mutual friend, didn't know him well, and he went up to him to say hi when he saw him. He tried to shake hands with him, but Loveridge just started swinging his elbows at David's head. He continued doing this until David shoved him away, at which point Loveridge hugged him and apologised. So clearly irrational behaviour. Loveridge then said, "I swear I'm going to bash someone tonight," and left. About half an hour later, Loveridge approached another group of men and suddenly punched one of them, Matthew Serrao, with no reason and again no warning, to the left side of his face. This fellow stumbled backwards, immediately felt dizzy and pain from where he'd been punched. And these two, Loveridge and Serrao, did not know each other at all. Serrao did approach Loveridge and asked him why he'd punched him, and Loveridge responded by attempting to punch him again, though he missed. So this reign of terror is continuing. About 10 minutes later, the exact same thing happened to a guy called Reese Saliba. He accidentally bumped shoulders with Loveridge as they passed each other, and Loveridge punched him in the face. Again, they were complete strangers. Another man, Aidan Ghazi, confronted Loveridge after witnessing him punch Saliba, asking why he had punched him, and Loveridge simply delivered what was described as a haymaker punch, striking Ghazi on the cheek. I had to look that up.
Did you?
Do you know what a haymaker?
Yeah, haymaker. Yeah, big, wide, swinging punch. Yeah, they're pretty easy to, you're signalling them because they're so obvious. Usually you can step out of the way or duck.
I read that it was often used to deliver a knockout in boxing.
Sure, but you'd want the guy to be, half gone already.
Right.
It's a big, wide, swinging punch. So
I guess if you visualise that, you can see he is probably totally intoxicated.
Yeah, and obviously has some significant impulse control problems,
So a push and a shove then broke out between Loveridge and his friends, and Ghazi and his friends, which was broken up by police who were on patrol in the area. Even with the police present, Loveridge continued to try and punch members of the other group, and the police eventually separated the groups and just sent them both on their way.
Wow.
No arrests.
No, it's interesting.
So 6 victims for Loveridge in the space of an hour or so. Yeah. So the next day, according to the trial transcripts, Loveridge was watching TV and a news story about Thomas Kelly came on the news. Loveridge apparently said to one of his friends, had I been in that fight? Was that one of my fights? Because he couldn't remember.
Wow.
He continued to claim he couldn't remember the events of the 7th of July, but he worried that it could have been him who hit Kelly. So he must have had some memory there somewhere. And after a police investigation, because there was plenty of CCTV footage in the area, Loveridge was very publicly arrested on the 18th of July. So remember, Thomas Kelly died on the 9th, while Loveridge was at Belmore Sports Ground watching the Bulldogs train.
So when you say the very, very public, did the police tipped off the media or something and they all
Well, it was
in?
just they didn't go to his house. They went to this public forum where he was in the stadium watching an NRL team. So there was, lots of attention on that arrest.
Yeah.
He declined to participate in a record of interview when he was arrested, and he was then charged and remanded in custody. He was eventually convicted, and it turns out he had a juvenile criminal history which contained offences of assault on officers. He had served probation for 12 months for that offence. That was in 2009, so he would have been about 15 at the time. In 2012, just a month before the attack on Kelly and the other victims, he was sentenced to 18 months probation for an assault occasioning bodily harm charge. That offence arose out of a fight at a party. So Loveridge and about 15 other guys had gate crashed a party in January 2011. Most people there were drinking. The parents were away.
Right.
Yeah, dangerous.
Yeah.
And as often happens, fights broke out, glass was thrown around. And so the guy who was hosting the party said, "Can everyone please leave?" at about 11:45 p.m., telling people the police were on their way. And Loveridge apparently responded by saying, "Who the fuck do you think you are, a hero or something?" before picking up 2 bottles from a bin he had previously kicked over. At this point, the host of the party ran away and Loveridge followed him. He threw one of the bottles at him but missed, and then he dumped the other bottle, kept running towards the guy and punched him in the face with his fists.
Wow.
So we definitely see a modus operandi for Loveridge when he's drunk. It turned into a big fight, with Loveridge continuing to punch this victim while other partygoers joined in. Police did in fact arrive and Loveridge was arrested on that occasion. When he was interviewed with his mum present, he made full admissions to that offence. He also wrote a public apology to that victim on Facebook.
Okay.
So that was his history, which obviously was relevant. So he was originally sentenced to an effective sentence of 4 years imprisonment for the death of Thomas Kelly.
So the charge it would have been a manslaughter.
Manslaughter.
Right, okay, yeah, because this new law comes in after.
That's right.
Right, I see.
That's right. So no intent to kill, which is what has always been the problem with one-punch cases.
Yes.
You can't conclusively prove that with one punch you had the intent to cause death or GBH.
Yes.
Obviously, we now know one punch can be fatal, and so that...
Well, sorry, we've sort of always known. I mean, that having a fight out and punching someone and them falling over and banging their head and passing away, that's a pretty standard manslaughter. I mean, that was David Hooks, the Australian, great Australian batsman. That's what happened to him.
But the problem is that with that charge and that presumption, you could raise the defence of accident that you subjectively did not intend or foresee. And it was not reasonably foreseeable that one punch would cause that. And depending on the circumstances, that was very often a successful defence.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the problem with the law before the specific charge came in.
So you say they're charged with manslaughter, they raise the defence of accident, it's a complete defence, they succeed, so they actually are completely acquitted, not guilty.
That's right.
And so what is the effect of these one-punch laws is they effectively get around that. You can't use accident as a defence.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's all you have to prove for an unlawful striking is that you hit someone to the head or the neck.
Yeah.
It caused the death.
Yeah.
And there's no provocation defence available. There's no defence of accident.
Yeah.
So that argument is lost.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously it's not a conviction of murder or manslaughter. It's its own conviction and it has a lower maximum penalty. It's 14 years, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Well, in Queensland it is.
Yeah.
It sort of can establish guilt more conclusively.
What do you mean? Well, I mean,
Well, it secures a conviction
Yeah,
without
well,
that
yeah.
argument,
Well, okay. It secures a conviction more easily. Let's put it like that. Yep.
which is fair.
I'm not sure that's right, but
Anyway, so originally he got 4 years imprisonment. It was appealed
Yep.
by prosecution, and it was increased to 10 years
Mhm.
for the manslaughter
Yep.
of Thomas Kelly. And then he got a range of penalties between 9 and 22 months imprisonment for the other offences he committed that night, because he was charged with all of those.
Yeah. My gut reaction to that sentence of 4 years for manslaughter in those circumstances is it seemed a bit low to me.
Yeah.
10 years might be a little high, but I did feel that 4 years was probably a little low.
Yes, and luckily the Court of Appeal agreed.
Yeah.
The court also gave him a 25% discount off the 14 years they said would have been otherwise appropriate because, he pleaded guilty.
He pleaded guilty. There you go.
Sorry, I got that wrong.
No, that's fine. He, there's CCTV footage of him. Presumably they, see his,
so many victims.
Yeah, I mean, it's just this incredible, crime spree.
Absolutely.
Totally
Spree.
antisocial.
And actually terrifying to think you're just walking down the street and next thing you're dying on the footpath.
Sure. Well, I mean, quite unusual. That what you've described is not, I've never seen an assault case. I mean, I've read assault cases like that. I've never personally done one, and I don't know anyone who's done one. But
We'll come back to that.
Yeah.
So I looked into it a little bit. And so while he was in prison, he actually continued to commit offences.
Wow. Okay.
He came to attention of authorities at his parole application hearing earlier this month. The court was told he'd been intoxicated and abusive to prison staff just in February of this year after sharing alcohol provided by another inmate. The explanation that was offered to the parole board was that he was suffering from heightened anxiety linked to his imminent release from prison.
Okay. I mean, I've seen that. I can understand that. I've seen prisoners do things like that.
Well, you can understand it, but it shows, rehabilitation seems a little lacking in that case.
Sure.
Alcohol's his Achilles heel, I would imagine.
Yeah, it does sound like it, doesn't it? I mean, I want to know what the alcohol was. It made of boot polish or
I don't know.
potatoes. It sounds interesting. Bit of moonshine in jail. Okay.
Unrelated to alcohol, but the court was also told that while in prison in 2015, he had become involved in an improper relationship with a female corrective officer, which prompted a transfer to Goulburn's Supermax Correctional Centre.
For the officer or for him?
For him.
Wow, that's a bit rough.
So that correctional centre is where high-risk offenders such as terrorists and murderers are sent.
I've had clients in Goulburn.
And then lastly, he had allegedly stomped on the head of another prisoner the week before his transfer.
Wow.
So despite all of that, the parole board were satisfied that it would be in the community's interest to release Loveridge, stating that a refusal of parole now would result in a much shorter time on parole, less supervision and more risk of reoffending.
Yeah, so we've talked about this before and the importance of parole. So they obviously decided we need to monitor him in society, make sure he can obviously not drink and punch people.
And so he was released in April.
That sounds sensible.
Kelly's family provided a statement to the court regarding the parole application. There is just so much evidence of the massive impact that Loveridge's actions have had on their family.
Yeah.
So not only did they lose Thomas because of his attack, but also their second son, Stuart. So Stuart was only 14 when Thomas was killed by Loveridge. And although the family were very close and supportive, and Stuart appeared to be doing okay, he was a prefect or house captain. He was very popular at school, like he did well. Yeah. When he was 18, he committed suicide.
Oh, isn't that terrible?
He had never recovered from the death of Thomas. Despite this, the Kelly family actually made it clear that while they did not support the intention to release Loveridge, they also would not be opposing such a decision.
Yeah.
With an extraordinary amount of compassion, they said, and this is a quote, "It is our view that for Thomas's death to mean something, it is imperative that every effort is made to ensure that a pathway is created to ensure that Mr. Loveridge's transition to community life is as smooth as possible." And I read that and I just thought, I don't know if I could be that generous.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they have a daughter as well.
Yeah.
But to lose both sons
Isn't that tragic?
is just
it's
so
heartbreaking.
horrible.
Yeah.
Obviously, while he's on parole, he will have to comply with strict conditions, including,
Not
importantly, no alcohol. He will have to participate in a violent offenders program.
Yeah.
He cannot have any contact with any victims or their families, and he must not associate with any co-offenders. He's also not allowed to visit the city of Sydney, the local area of Shoalhaven, or the suburb of Neutral Bay.
Is he being electronically monitored?
I don't know. And his parole will continue until May 2026. So it is a substantial period of time on parole, and hopefully, it proves successful. Loveridge provided an interview to media 2 weeks after his release.
Yeah.
And I thought it was worth sharing what he said.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, he was 18 when he committed this. He's still a young man.
Yeah.
He's 30. After spending more than a decade inside some of the state's toughest prisons, he says he was just a kid when he went out one night and messed up, and he never intended to kill. A quote from him was, "I was 18. I was still at school when that happened. I wasn't off the rails. I just went out and made a mistake. I'm extremely remorseful. I'm sorry to that family and to my own family and the people I've hurt. There's a lot of people who have suffered because of me, and I know that." And so I think that's good that that's how he feels.
Yes.
Kind of reminds me of, he was a good bloke who made a bad
I know
decision.
you don't like the good bloke scenario. Well, I don't think we could say that he was a good bloke. He did have a criminal history.
Yeah, he did.
And of intentional violence against strangers.
Yeah.
So but that does, I was interested, you probably don't have any of his sort of backstory, but I was interested to know what that caused that, because I've seen people like that before in criminal law, and they come from violent homes and they've been victims of violence themselves, and they have poor impulse control, and then they drink alcohol, and they're young and feel like they're in bulletproof. And
actually, well, I don't know, because I read the sentence transcript, and there wasn't much either way about his background. It wasn't that he was there with a supportive family that they mentioned, but also there wasn't mention of abuse or tragedy in his youth. I mean,
maybe he was just young and entitled.
Happen.
Maybe he was just an entitled young male who drank, and I mean, I don't think that happens very often, but I have seen it, entitled young males who drink and are violent when they're young.
Yeah,
I have seen that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you say you don't know of these cases, but my best friend, so her family, my family, our kids have grown up together. She's got 2 boys the same age as my 2 boys. And when he was 18, he went out in Surface. It was 2 weeks before he was meant to sit his ATAR exams. And Surface Paradise, nothing good happens after 2 a.m. But he was the victim of a one-punch attack. And my friend, because the police got involved, they were on the scene. They're everywhere in Southport. Yes. And she watched the CCTV footage of the attack on her son. And he was literally standing on the footpath looking at his phone, and these guys came out of one of the clubs and sort of barreled into her son. And he stumbled back a bit, like off the footpath, and stepped forward again, still didn't even really pay attention, was still looking at his phone. And this guy just punched him full in the face.
Yeah.
He flew into the road, Cavill Avenue.
Yeah.
A car almost hit him.
Yeah.
My friend said she watched his head bounce on the cement, and thank God he got up and hopped off the road, but he had a fractured eye socket, blurred vision.
Yeah.
I mean, literally there, but for the grace of God, go he. Like he could have been Thomas Kelly.
Yeah.
And so this guy, they identified him, the guy who had punched him. He had absconded to New South Wales.
Right.
They used super recognisers to identify him. Yeah. Because the injuries to my friend's son were not permanent.
Yeah.
Because they healed.
The blurred vision cleared up there.
And the fractured eye socket wasn't serious enough to characterise it as grievous bodily harm.
Yeah.
So the charge was AOBH, and there is a charge out there for him. but the police have said it's not enough to extradite him to
Wow.
Queensland.
Okay.
So if he comes back to Queensland, there'll be a warrant for him. But if he stays in New South Wales, there's nothing.
Yeah.
And so I mean that I'm going to talk about that a bit, but I think the criminality of his actions is actually identical to Loveridge's. But the disparity in consequence is, and I know it's based on injury, but I also think we need to think about that criminality issue.
Yeah.
As I said at the start, because of this case of Loveridge, New South Wales introduced one-punch laws and also triggered Sydney's lockout laws.
Oh, okay,
Yeah, so it had a lot of impact in terms of consequences. So it was November 2013, just days after the DPP appealed that 4-year sentence originally imposed, that the New South Wales Attorney General announced the proposal for a one-punch law. They based theirs on the already existing Western Australian version.
Right.
And that carries a maximum of 20 years imprisonment. So the idea behind that was to send the strongest message possible to violent and drunken thugs that assaulting people is not a rite of passage, is what they said. And as I flagged, unlike a manslaughter charge, the new law would apply to any assault which resulted in death with no typical defences available, such as provocation or accident.
Yeah.
So then I had a little look, and there was legislation regarding one-punch laws passed in WA in 2008. They were the first. Then in the Northern Territory in 2012, and in Queensland we passed our laws in 2014.
Yes.
And so then I had a little look to see what had triggered that for Queensland. And so pre the one-punch legislation, there were a couple of cases that garnered some attention and I think probably pushed the passing of our one-punch laws here. So one of the first cases I wanted to talk about was a guy called Matthew Stanley.
Yep.
This was from 2006. He was 15 at the time and he was bashed to death outside an 18th birthday party at a Brisbane Bayside hotel. His attacker, who was just 16 at the time, did plead guilty to manslaughter. We then had in 2009 former Brisbane Bronco Todd Parnell, who was felled in a brawl at a post-match party on Bribie Island at just 22 years old. He was taken off life support 2 days later. And his accused, Wally Hung, was charged with his murder, but then was convicted of manslaughter. And he got jailed for just under 7 years.
Yeah.
Just a month later, 15-year-old Jai Morecambe was killed in a fight at Mullumbimby High School just over the border in New South Wales. And despite doctors' efforts, he died in a Gold Coast hospital. Andrew Houlihan, aged 23, was caught up in a brawl between two groups of men at Coolangatta on the Gold Coast in September 2009. CCTV footage showed that he was knocked to the ground with one punch to the head. He was then punched again when he was on the ground.
Yeah.
The brawl continued around him as he lay unconscious on the ground. I mean, the list is endless.
Yeah.
March 2009, Malcolm Butterworth died when he was punched outside a Toogoolawah pub, which is west of Ipswich. He suffered multiple skull fractures in what a court heard was an argument over boots.
Wow.
A 25-year-old man was charged with manslaughter over the incident. He argued he'd been acting in self-defense and he was found not guilty.
There you go.
In April 2010, a homeless man, James Grace, was punched in the back of the head in Brisbane's east, which knocked him unconscious, caused him to suffer a traumatic brain injury. His attacker, William Kiss, was jailed for 4 years, suspended after 12 months.
Wow.
Yep. The court heard Kiss had returned to his badly injured victim and said, "Next time I'll kill you."
Wow. Okay.
Late November 2013, Australian rules coach Wayne Dover died when he was attacked outside a Maroochydore nightclub. 3 men were initially charged with his murder, but at a committal hearing, a magistrate determined there was insufficient evidence to proceed with murder and instead substituted manslaughter charges.
I find it bizarre that they are charging with murder after punch-ups. I mean,
I don't know. I think these days you probably could argue murder from a one punch because there's been so much knowledge and awareness that one punch can kill that if you punch someone once with such force, then circumstantially it would be open to find that there was an intention to at least cause GBH. I think the problem also, though, with a murder charge on that basis is that in not all but most of these cases, alcohol's involved.
Yeah.
And to prove intention, alcohol can be argued that they were too drunk to form that intention.
Yeah, you got to be pretty drunk for that, though.
It's open to be argued.
Yeah. I do know a case where they argued that self-defense was open. So there was a fight. A person retaliated and
Beat them.
And won the fight and then was charged with the offence. Wanted to argue self-defence at the trial. The court said no. Went to the Court of Appeal, said we should have been able to argue self-defence because it was only one punch.
Well, it was only one punch, but also he said that the other guy had raised his fist as though to punch him, and he said, and I know one punch can kill. So I had a fear of death or GBH.
Yes,
and
so
I
can respond with lethal force.
And it worked.
I know.
Which I don't think was what the legislature intended.
I know, unintended consequences. That's what you've always got to watch out for on these funny changes of, creating. I'm not a big fan of specialist, crimes like one punch can kill. I mean, like just deal with it with manslaughter.
But very clever lawyering.
Well, that was Peter Callaghan, who's now Justice Peter Callaghan. He argued that. So, yeah, he was silk and a very clever lawyer and still is a very clever judge.
Yes, yes. I mean, I could keep going. There's so many examples of this. But then I wanted to see, well, okay, what happened once we brought in the legislation in Queensland? What changed? So in 2017, a 20-year-old called Arik Mayotte was sentenced to just under 6 years in jail for the one-punch killing of a 54-year-old man in a Goodness Street in 2015.
Wow.
He was the first person in Queensland charged with unlawful striking causing death. And sentencing was decided on the basis that the victim had, in fact, taunted the accused with a racist insult.
Wow, okay.
And the dark-skinned Mayotte from Sudan had exhibited behavioural problems as a result of racism and bullying.
Okay.
And so he still got almost 6 years. So a big increase. Like if we think about the sentence that was suspended after 12 months, we are seeing...
But the one to suspend up to 12 months was a bit of an anomaly. I mean, that doesn't sound like it's much different from he would have got on a manslaughter charge.
Well, I hate thinking about the manslaughter penalties. They're so varied.
Yeah. But, I mean, I suppose he couldn't on a manslaughter charge argue provocation, could he? Because it wouldn't do anything.
No.
Yeah.
So then in 2017, a fellow called Armstrong Renata, who was 23, was sentenced to 7 years in jail for the one-punch killing of Cole Miller, who was 18, in Fortitude Valley in 2016. Renata punched Cole Miller in the back of the head in an unprovoked attack, causing the teenager to fall and hit his head on the pavement, and he suffered a fatal brain injury.
Okay.
The Court of Appeal then increased that sentence of 7 years to 9 years and 6 months in 2018, finding that the original sentence was manifestly inadequate, which is the threshold for a successful appeal against sentence. And the Court of Appeal said it is no understatement to say that this is a chilling example of the cowardly, vicious conduct that the unlawful striking charge was intended to address. When they asked about the difference with Mayotte's case, the judge said that it was not comparable because the offending occurred in the afternoon in a suburban street, in contrast to the respondent's alcohol-fueled violence in the early hours of the morning in Renata's case.
And there was some, I mean, presumably it was still a sucker punch, but I mean, if you're being racially taunted,
that's right.
You've got to expect somebody might respond to that.
Some provocation was offered. That's right. The Attorney General at the time was Yvette D'Arth, and she argued that the sentence for the unlawful striking in Renata's case should have been treated more harshly than manslaughter cases, and the Court of Appeal actually agreed. They said that the prosecution had originally asked for 12 years imprisonment, and while that period of 11 to 12 years would be an appropriate starting point for an unlawful striking causing death, They took into account Renata's youth,
Yes.
his plea of guilt,
Yes.
and the fact he had already spent time in a maximum security prison,
Okay.
reducing it to 9.5.
9.5. So it went from 6. So 6 for punching someone in the
7.
afternoon in the street.
Oh, yes.
And then next one is punching him in the back of the head in the middle, at night at sort of nightclub or something.
Yeah.
And it goes up to 9. Sounds about
But
right.
said, like on record, that
Could have
11
been
to 12
11 to 12.
was a starting point. So we've currently got this week in the Southport Magistrates Court a one-punch case going
Wow.
through. Yep.
Committal hearing.
Committal hearing. And I am going to say his name wrong, but the
Okay.
accused is Oshay Tuiasu,
Okay.
I think. So he's been charged with the fatal one punch of a guy called Toro George back in December 2021.
Yeah.
He told the court in December 2022 he'd lashed out at George after George had assaulted his wife.
Ooh.
But counsel representing him this week, Craig Eberhardt,
Yes.
posed a different tactic.
KC. Craig Eberhardt KC.
KC, during cross-examination. And that's because the autopsy report revealed that the victim, George, had a blood alcohol content of 0.246 and traces of cocaine in his system when he died.
Yeah.
And he was also, I'm not sure, I don't have a picture of him, but his stats sound like he was quite overweight.
Yes.
And so defense counsel queried whether the drugs, the alcohol,
Yeah.
and his weight could have caused him to suffer a cardiac arrest coincidentally on that night.
Yes.
The
No,
medic-
I have actually argued that on a GBH. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And a committal hearing.
Successfully?
Successfully. Well, they reduced the charge to assault occasioning bodily harm, and I think we pleaded. Yeah, but the guy who was punched was so drunk that his heart stopped, and so he was punched. He was on the ground unconscious. Somebody, not my client, came and kicked him in the head. In the ambulance on the way to the hospital, his heart stopped. They restarted his heart. They charged my client with grievous bodily harm on the basis that it was a life-threatening injury because his heart stopped. But his blood alcohol level was so high at the committal hearing, I was like, well, you can't rule out that it stopped because he was so drunk. And the doctor was like, yes, I agree. And they reduced the charge.
But he's okay. Well, so the medical examiner here confirmed that Tuiasu had punched George hard enough to bruise him,
Yes.
but not hard enough to fracture or break bones or teeth.
Okay.
George died about 19 minutes after the punch when his heart stopped beating due to a lack of oxygen to the brain. The medical examiner said she did not agree that the defense counsel's proposition of a coincidental heart attack was likely, saying that it would be possible but extremely unlikely,
Yeah.
saying it is almost inconceivable that at that exact moment his obesity that he has had for a chronic period of time has led to his death. So he's on bail at the moment,
Interesting. Watch
waiting
this
to
space.
see what happens.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the presence of this charge
Yeah.
certainly doesn't seem to have curtailed.
It was
the
never going
activity.
to curtail it.
No,
I mean, that's so
I know.
ridiculous. These are
But it's
young males
partly
who are
meant-
drunk. They are not thinking, oh, I better wonder about the one punch can kill laws. I mean, it's ridiculous to say, oh, this is a deterrent. A deterrent to young drunk males. I mean, nothing's going to deter a young drunk male. I mean, that's just crazy
I
talk.
know. So the only thing, the only thing that I worry about with this, not worry about, but that I think maybe could be addressed is the fact, like I raised with my friend's son, is that the criminality behind a fatal one punch and a non-fatal one punch is actually the same.
Yeah.
But the outcomes are just so different. And there was one case I wanted to talk about that I think illustrates this
Is it
better
David
than
Hooks?
anything. No, it's not David Hooks.
Then
I
we're
do
getting
have
to-
some notes on him.
Right.
But this was a victim, Kenneth Ball,
Yep.
who was 60. He was happy, he was healthy, and he had been talking to his daughter's ex-boyfriend. So the ex-boyfriend was Thomas Short, and on the day of the offence, Short had turned up twice to the family home,
Yep.
clearly under the effects of methamphetamine.
Wow.
They knew that he took that drug.
Right. Okay.
On the second occasion, our victim, Kenneth Ball, spoke with Short, and Short began to walk away, and Ball followed him.
Yeah.
And with no warning, Short turned and hit Ball. And in Short's words, I laid him out.
Yes.
The punch rendered Ball unconscious. He fell back and he hit his head on a tiled veranda. Short simply walked away, from the home.
Right.
Ball was found unresponsive and an ambulance was called. He had suffered traumatic head injuries. He underwent surgery, which included having part of his skull removed. I thought that was the word, but I wanted to check.
Yeah.
He spent a number of weeks in a coma.
Yeah.
And 8 months after the attack, he was still undergoing rehabilitation in hospital. He is now confined to a wheelchair. He has lost sight in one eye. He needs 24-hour care. He struggles to communicate and will likely never walk again. There was no real reason for the punch. The accused was on drugs at the time, and when he was being interviewed by the police, Short said Ball's lights went out. So he knew that that's what he'd done. And he got a
sort
sentence.
of the aim of punching somebody is to knock them unconscious. So
he got a sentence. What do you think?
is this under the one punch?
No, because he didn't cause death.
Ah, okay. So it's a GBH. Oh, so you're testing me now. I'm going to guess 5 years.
At least 2 years and 10 months.
Wow. Okay.
Yep. The family of Kenneth Ball told media that it is not justice, and I wholeheartedly agree.
It does sound a bit low.
His daughter said he, the accused, can continue his life as per normal with only a small chunk of it missing, whereas my dad and my family have life sentences.
Yes.
The sentencing judge acknowledged it was a relatively lenient non-parole period,
Yes.
despite also noting that the attack was catastrophic and had far-reaching consequences for the family.
Yes.
She, again, pointed to the fact that longer parole period would be beneficial in his rehabilitation.
So it was 2 years, 2.5 years head sentence. So how much did he serve in prison?
Well, 5 years and 2 months was the head sentence.
Oh, sorry, 5 years and 2 months.
Yes,
it's close.
But it was called
It is 2.5.
recklessly causing serious harm, and the maximum for that is 15 years.
We don't know what the his story was.
No, we don't. We don't. But he could be eligible for parole as early as August 2025.
And when they say there was nothing to provoke the attack, I don't entirely accept that, because I've seen a number of cases where following somebody is the person who is being followed finds that provocative. And I can understand that. I mean, I suffer from a bit of pedestrian rage when I'm walking along. And if there's somebody walking behind me at the same speed, it annoys me. So I'm not saying it's an excuse at all or a justification, but to say there's absolutely no provocation, I'm like, well, he was following him, you know.
I know. I think what gets me is that it's nothing in the accused circumstances that account for the reduced sentence. You know, like they've done exactly the same conduct. So you think about Short's conduct and that one punch causing him to strike his head and suffer fractures.
Yeah.
Because of medical intervention, his victim didn't die.
Yeah.
Whereas someone whose victim does die is subject to much harsher penalties. And I think, should we not be assessing the criminality of the conduct? Should it not be an unlawful striking as the charge, and then the consequence is not determinative of whether that charge can be brought? You know, like it's...
But well, isn't the problem with doing that who is making this assessment? The DPP. I mean, that's sort of an assessment of fact. You'd want there be no charge, and the court, you sort of place all the information before the court, and the court comes up with the charge, which is just really inappropriate.
But it's the same conduct. It's the unlawful striking to the head or the neck.
Sure, but we always, in all assault cases, in all offences to the person, categorise it based on the injury. We've done that for hundreds of years.
The reason for bringing in unlawful striking was because this kind of attack is, you know, what's called the coward's punch. And it's often without any warning or notice. There's no ability to defend yourself. There's, you know, it's quite different to other types of assaults.
Well, it is, because I've created it to be different to other types of assaults.
Because there was a reason for it.
Well, I'm not sure there was a reason for it. I mean, but let's not make the tail wag the dog. I mean, you can't go, we brought in this new offence, it's not doing what we want to do, so now we're going to start changing, you know, some fundamental aspects of the criminal law.
Exactly what the legislature do.
Well, let's hope they don't change fundamental aspects of the criminal law, but they certainly shouldn't. I mean, I just think, I'm not entirely sure that this one punch, it doesn't seem to me that it's had any particular effect on the kind of sentences that are being handed out.
They are harsher.
Okay, so they're getting a bit harsher. You can deal with that in other ways. I just think these specialist offences they create, there's unintended consequences. They don't always do what the legislature thinks because they're dreamt up by policy people and politicians. And they are the worst people who should be doing anything to do with criminal law. Because they're not interested in criminal law. They have no experience of criminal law. I mean, I know some people who work in the department who are lawyers, but I mean, they work in, all they do is sit and come up with policy, and they've had some experience.
A lot of them have practiced.
Okay. Have they had a broad experience of practice for
one
the
of my
defence and the
friends worked
prosecution?
for the DPP for many years. She was amazing, and she was in policy.
Yeah, so she's had one. She's been on one side of the in the criminal justice system. She goes off and writes policy. Wow.
Well, but being on one side, you're also exposed to the whole court process.
You're exposed to police officers and victims in a way that you aren't.
Counsel.
Well, in an adversarial system, yeah, defence counsel.
Yeah, but so you're hearing the arguments, you're seeing.
Yeah, but you're not. But as a defence counsel, you're dealing with police officers in an adversarial way. You're dealing with the prosecutors in an adversarial way. You're dealing with your client. You're dealing with your client's family. You're hearing all of that stuff. I mean, if these people are going to be writing policy, well, let them work for legal aid as well. Work for the DPP. Work for legal aid. Go off and do some policy.
That would never work. I could never do defence work.
Oh, a lot of people do. I've seen work for both prosecution and defence. I must say I couldn't do it either. I just couldn't.
I prosecute?
I prosecuted once for the RSPCA. It was just...
Did you?
Yeah. I had to go up to Gympie because you do it pro bono, the RSPCA,
Yeah.
So you say, sure, I'll prosecute for you. And they gave me this brief, and it was to prosecute this farmer. It was for not feeding his horses. So animal cruelty for not feeding his horses.
Yes.
He's not feeding his horses because there was a drought and he has no money and he was not doing anything. And so I say to the RSPCA lawyer, okay, right, what he was the farmer's pleading guilty, so there's no trial. So what penalty should I ask for? And she says, you should ask for a fine. And I said, if he had any money to pay a fine, he'd be feeding his horses. And the RSPCA was like, no, you have to ask for a fine. I was like, okay. So I go into court. The guy pleads guilty. He gets up and says, oh, sorry, Your Honour, I've got no money. I'm, on the dole, whatever. The magistrate said, yes, thank you. Oh, Mr. Crowley, what penalty are you seeking? And I said, I'm instructed, Your Honour, which is always code for this is not what I think.
I don't agree. Yeah.
I'm instructed, Your Honour, to ask for a fine. And the magistrate goes, Mr. Crowley, if he had money to pay a fine, he'd be feeding his horses, and I just glare at my instructing bloody solicitor.
So what happened to him?
Oh, they gave him, like a good behaviour bond or something.
Right.
So, and I just walked out and went, yeah, I'm never doing that again. That's ridiculous.
Well, I think prosecution is a great job and very important.
Yeah.
Anyway, we got a bit sidetracked there.
We did.
So that was my thoughts on One Punch Can Kill.
Yes, I mean, I accept that there's, I'd like to see the stats on it. This issue of, are there young people out drunk more often than there used to be? I mean, if you're going to have young people out and drunk, there's going to be fights between males.
I think yes. I mean, I have very recent experience with two of my children.
You've been out in the nightclub scene?
No, I do a lot of picking up.
Right.
In Cavill Avenue because two of my children are now over 18.
Yeah.
And honestly, you have to drive along Cavill Ave at about 5 kilometres per hour because people are just walking out in front of you. They're clearly drunk.
Yes.
And my daughter, who's 20, has been in a nightclub more than 3 times when fights have broken out inside the club. She's been slammed up against a wall just because of the force.
Yeah.
Her and her friends immediately know just to scoot away to a corner when it happens. And then obviously my friend's son was the victim of the one punch. And my son, who's 19, he already is over Surfers Paradise for the most part because it's just not pleasant to be there. They try and find alternative places.
Yeah.
Obviously he likes to go out drinking.
Yeah, Cavill Avenue, for those who are not from Surfers Paradise, the main sort of drag and Surfers Paradise, and then Orchid Avenue off that is where all the nightclubs are.
Yeah.
And to describe it as seedy would be a kind description, I think.
I think so. I mean, look, anyone who knows my son will be like, he definitely goes out. He does definitely go out.
Yes.
But he's more recently trying to find alternatives to Surfers Paradise.
Yeah. But is that because the population's larger? So you've got to do it on a per capita basis. You can't go, well, there's more fights than when I was young. It's like, yeah, the population was smaller when you were young. So, I mean, I don't know what the stats are on that. I'd like to see them. The Australian Institute of Criminology might keep them. So if there is an increase, then that might warrant a change to the law. I'm not sure, and this idea of are sucker punches then increasing? Are they so bad that we need to have a specific charge for them?
Oh, we definitely have to keep the charge.
Yeah, I don't know about that. But anyway,
no, we do.
It doesn't seem to have had any particular effect that you couldn't have achieved in another way. And as you say, it's had unintended consequences because we've had at least one successful case where somebody who assaulted somebody successfully argued self-defense on the basis that they thought that they were going to be given a one punch that could kill them.
I know. It's complex. I do think, I've said to my boys always, if a fight breaks out, you just walk away.
Absolutely.
But I guess if your friend's getting attacked or, I don't know. It's a hard one, but I definitely think we need the charge. I think it should be broader.
Wow. Okay.
And that's it.
That was, it was very interesting. Thank you, Lizzie. There's a lot of food for thought, I think, in that one.
And I think we really need to just keep in our thoughts Thomas Kelly's family.
Oh, absolutely.
I really feel for them.
What an incredible tragedy.
Generosity when it comes to Loveridge. So hopefully he does maximise his rehabilitation on parole.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right.
All right.
Thanks, Lizzie. Thanks for tuning into this episode. You can find links to the cases that we discussed in the description. You can also find a link to Guardian Criminal Law, and a big shout out to them for making this podcast possible.
The majority of criminal cases involve people, normal people like you, people like me, who find themselves in an unusual set of circumstances that would not usually occur in their life. My name is Mark Savick and I'm here to assist you with your criminal matter. I look forward to hearing from you and being of assistance to you.
If you're interested in clips, you can look at them on Instagram and TikTok. Just search for Justice Matters Pod. See you next episode.